When my boyfriend told me he had no wallet and had to crash at another woman's place, I didn't argue. I simply gathered every gift I'd ever given him and delivered them straight to her doorstep. His raging 4 a.m. messages lit up my phone, but what came after uncovered the truth he thought I'd never find. I found his wallet in his nightstand drawer at 9:47 p.m., the same wallet he'd just texted me about losing across town. My hand was still holding my phone, his message glowing on the screen. "Babe, my wallet's gone. Stuck across town with no cash for a ride. Crashing at Sienna's tonight. Don't worry, okay?" I stared at the brown leather sitting there perfectly intact, credit cards visible through the clear window, and something inside me went absolutely silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence of finally understanding. He wasn't across town. He wasn't stranded. He wasn't helpless. He was at another woman's apartment, and he thought I was too tired, too trusting, too beaten down to check. I picked up the wallet, felt its weight in my palm, and made a decision that would change everything. If he wanted to spend the night at Sienna's place so badly, I'd make sure he got everything he needed. Starting with every single gift I'd ever wasted on him. "I'm Clara, and this is the night I stopped believing his lies." The text had arrived 20 minutes earlier while I was wiping down the last table at Rosewood Diner. I'd been working a double, 7 in the morning until 9 at night, and my feet were killing me. The kitchen lights flickered overhead like they'd been doing for weeks, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that made even fresh food look spoiled. I'd pulled out my phone with one hand while the other kept scrubbing at a ketchup stain that had probably been there since lunch. When I read August's message, my hands had gone cold. Not the gradual cold of forgetting your gloves in winter, but instant bone-deep cold that started in my fingertips and shot straight up my arms into my chest. I'd stood there under those dying fluorescent lights, reading those words over and over while Janelle called out good night from the back door and the cook scraped down the grill with sounds like nails on metal. Everything felt distant, underwater, like I was watching my life happen to someone else. I'd clocked out without saying anything to anyone, grabbed my coat from the hook by the staff bathroom, and walked home through streets that smelled like October rain and wet pavement. $47 in tips sat folded in my apron pocket, money that would go toward whichever bill was screaming loudest this week. The gas notice or the internet warning, or maybe just groceries if I was lucky. 3.5 years. That's how long I'd been with August. 3.5 years of working doubles and split shifts while he figured himself out, and explored opportunities, and built his network. 3.5 years of me carrying us both financially while he promised things were about to turn around. Any day now, just wait and see. My apartment building came into view. All peeling paint and crooked mailboxes. The kind of place where the elevator had been broken for 2 months and nobody expected it to get fixed. I'd climbed 3 flights of stairs, my legs protesting every step, and found 2 disconnection notices taped to my door. Gas and internet. Both printed on that aggressive neon paper designed to humiliate you, to announce your struggles to every neighbor who walked past. I'd peeled them off and shoved them in my coat pocket, adding them to the collection of evidence that documented exactly how one-sided our relationship had become. Inside, the apartment had been dark and silent except for the rhythmic drip from the bathroom faucet. The faucet August had promised to fix 8 months ago. Then 6 months ago. Then he'd stopped promising and I'd stopped asking, just put a bowl underneath to catch the water and tried not to hear it when I was trying to sleep. I'd dropped my keys on the counter and they'd clattered too loud in the quiet. Then I'd pulled out my phone and read his message again, really studying it this time. "Babe, my wallet's gone. Stuck across town with no cash for a ride. Crashing at Sienna's tonight. Don't worry, okay?" Each word felt deliberate. Chosen. Babe, to create false intimacy. Wallet's gone, to manufacture a crisis. Stuck across town, to explain why he couldn't come home. Sienna's tonight, to test exactly how much disrespect I'd swallow without protest. And finally, don't worry, okay? The preemptive silencing of any objection I might dare to raise. Something had shifted in my chest then. Not broken, clarified. Like a bone that's been set wrong for years suddenly snapping back into its proper place. I'd walked to the hall closet and pulled out the cardboard box from last Christmas. The one that had held his noise-canceling headphones. The ones he'd begged for. The ones I'd worked 3 weeks of overtime to afford. Then, moving with strange mechanical calm, I'd opened the drawer of his nightstand. That's where I'd found it. The wallet. His wallet. The brown leather one I'd given him for our second anniversary, the one he'd researched for weeks before dropping hints until I finally understood what he wanted. The one I'd saved for by skipping lunches and walking to work instead of taking the bus. It sat there perfectly intact, credit cards lined up in their slots, his driver's license visible through the clear plastic window. Even some cash tucked in the billfold. I'd picked it up, felt its weight in my hand, and that's when the silence came. Not the silence of shock or confusion. The silence of finally, completely understanding. He wasn't across town. He wasn't stranded without money or options. He wasn't some helpless victim of circumstance who needed to crash at a friend's place. He was lying. Deliberately. Calculatedly. And he'd assumed I was too exhausted from working 10-hour shifts, too beaten down by 3 years of carrying us both, too trained to accept his excuses to ever think of checking his story. Tina. The name burned in my mind. I'd met her twice, and both times had left me with that sick feeling in my stomach that women learn to trust even when we're told we're being paranoid. The first time was at Marcus's birthday party last spring. She'd monopolized August's attention for hours, touching his shoulder when she talked, laughing too loud at his jokes, leaning into him like I wasn't standing right there holding a beer I didn't even want to drink. When I'd mentioned feeling uncomfortable on the drive home, August had turned it back on me so smoothly I'd almost missed the manipulation. You're being paranoid, Clara. He's just friendly. You're inventing drama because you're insecure. The second time was 3 months ago when I'd gotten off work early and decided to surprise him with lunch at that coffee shop downtown. I'd walked in and found them hunched over his laptop together, her hand resting casually on his forearm. They'd both looked up startled when I appeared at their table, and August had been too quick with his explanation. We're just collaborating on a project idea. The laptop had closed just a little too fast. Now here I was holding physical proof that he'd lied about the most basic verifiable fact. If he'd lie about something this simple, something I could check in 30 seconds, what else had he been lying about for months? For years. I set the wallet down on the kitchen counter and stared at it. My reflection looked back at me from the darkened window above the sink, still in my diner uniform with its permanent grease stains, hair pulled back in a ponytail that had started falling apart hours ago, exhaustion written across every feature. But something in my eyes looked different. Harder. Clearer. I pulled the cardboard box from the closet and set it on the kitchen table. Then I started gathering items, moving through the apartment with purpose. The smartwatch from his dresser, the one he desperately wanted last Christmas, claiming it would help him stay organized and hit his goals. It sat uncharged in its box, barely used after the first week. The Italian leather belt I'd bought him for his birthday. The cologne that had cost 3 full shifts worth of tips. The vintage denim jacket from that weekend trip to Portland that I'd paid for entirely while he promised to get me back later. The books. Got the books. Shoe Dog, The 4-Hour Workweek, Think and Grow Rich. All pristine, spines uncracked, bookmarks still on page 1. Every one of them purchased because he'd sworn he was really going to focus on personal development this time. Every item I added to the box was another memory of me trying to fill the space where his effort should have been. Another piece of evidence that I'd been playing both roles in this relationship. The partner who loved and the partner who provided, the dreamer and the realist, the person who gave and the person who never received. The box grew heavier as I packed, not from weight but from understanding. I found other things too. A receipt crumpled in the back of his drawer from Tavern and Tap, the upscale bar downtown. $147.63. Dated 3 weeks ago. The same night he told me he was helping Marcus move furniture and couldn't make our dinner reservation. The reservation I'd saved 2 months of tips to afford. I photographed the receipt with my phone before adding it to the box. When I was done, I sealed everything with packing tape. The sound was sharp and final in the quiet apartment. I grabbed a permanent marker and wrote across the top in bold capital letters. For August, since he's staying the night. Clara. I stood back and looked at what I'd created. This wasn't just a box of his belongings. This was 3.5 years of proof that I'd been loving someone who'd been using me. It was 11:52 p.m. I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare. I knew Sienna's address. August had mentioned it once with that telltale tone of envy, talking about her insane corner unit on the 15th floor, like he was already imagining himself living there. While I waited for the car, I sat on the couch holding my phone, looking at his message one more time. Don't worry, okay? But I wasn't worried. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't worried or anxious or trying to convince myself that things would get better if I just worked harder, gave more, loved deeper. I was done worrying. I was done believing. And I was about to make sure August understood exactly what he'd lost. The rideshare notification lit up my screen. 5 minutes away. I stood in the middle of my apartment holding that box with August's name written across the top. And suddenly 5 minutes felt like too long and not long enough at the same time. My heart was racing, not from panic but from something else. Clarity mixed with adrenaline, the feeling you get when you're about to do something that can't be undone. I set the box down on the kitchen table and looked around the apartment with new eyes. There was more. So much more. I'd packed the obvious things. The wallet, the watch, the books. But now I was seeing evidence everywhere I looked. 3.5 years of me trying to fill the space where his effort should have been, scattered across every surface and shoved into every drawer. I walked back to the bedroom and opened his closet. The vintage denim jacket hung there, the one from that flea market in Portland during our romantic weekend getaway last year. I'd paid for the entire trip. The hotel, the gas, the meals, everything, while August promised he'd get me back when his freelance check cleared. He never did. I'd worked extra shifts for 2 months to afford that weekend, convincing myself that quality time together was an investment in our future. I pulled the jacket off its hanger. The fabric still smelled faintly of the vintage store, that musty combination of old cotton and someone else's memories. August had worn it exactly 3 times before deciding it wasn't really his style after all. Into the box it went. The smartwatch sat on his dresser, still in its charging dock but completely dead. He'd begged for it last Christmas, sent me links to articles about how it would revolutionize his productivity, help him build better habits, track his fitness goals. This is exactly what I need to finally get serious about my health, he'd said. I'd wrapped extra shifts during the holiday rush, dealt with the worst customers of the year, smiled through harassment and single-digit tips, all to afford that watch. He'd used it enthusiastically for about a week. Then sporadically for another week. Then never again. I unplugged it from the charger and added it to the box. The Italian leather belt hung on the back of the bathroom door. I'd found it at a boutique downtown during my lunch break, spending money I should have saved for groceries because August had admired a similar one in a magazine and I'd wanted to surprise him. $78 for a belt. I remembered standing at the register with my debit card, mentally calculating whether I could make it to next payday on what would be left. The belt came off the hook and joined everything else. I moved through the apartment like I was cataloging evidence for a trial. The cologne on the bathroom counter, the bottle still 3/4 full despite costing more than my electric bill. 3 full shifts worth of tips for a scent he'd worn maybe twice before saying it was too strong, and going back to his drugstore body spray. The wireless speaker on the kitchen windowsill, dusty and unused, purchased because he needed it for his morning motivation routine, that lasted all of 4 days before he went back to sleeping until noon. The running shoes in the closet, barely scuffed, that he'd insisted would get him back in shape, and help him clear his head for better focus. I'd bought them instead of replacing my own work shoes that had holes in the soles. I'd been stuffing cardboard inside my sneakers to cover the worn-through spots while brand-new Nikes sat unused in our closet. Every item I added made the box heavier, but not from physical weight. From accumulated understanding. I opened the drawer of our coffee table, the cheap particle board one we'd gotten from someone's curb on trash day, and found the charging cables he'd needed urgently for his projects. The portable battery that would let him work on the go. The laptop stand that would improve his posture and productivity. All of it unused. All of it paid for with my money, my time, my exhausted body standing on aching feet for hours while strangers yelled about their eggs being too runny or their coffee not being hot enough. I found the gym bag in the hall closet, tag still attached. Another birthday gift. Another promise to really commit this time to the fitness routine that would change everything. The bag had never seen the inside of a gym. The coffee maker sat on the counter, the one he'd insisted would change his productivity game, because he'd read some article about successful people's morning routines. I'd bought it instead of replacing my winter coat that had a broken zipper. I'd spent that whole winter holding my coat closed with my hand because August needed a coffee maker for the motivation he never found. As I packed, I wasn't just gathering his belongings. I was excavating the person I used to be. The woman who believed that love meant endless giving, that partnership meant carrying someone else's weight until your back broke, that if you just sacrificed enough, gave enough, worked hard enough, he'd eventually meet you halfway. I'd been so wrong. My hand brushed against something crumpled in the back of his sock drawer as I was checking for anything else I'd bought him. Paper. I pulled it out and smoothed it under the lamp. A receipt from Tavern and Tap. My stomach dropped even though I was already kneeling. The date glared at me 3 weeks ago. The total, $147.63. I knew that date. I knew it because I'd spent 2 months saving tips to make a reservation at Giovanni's, the nice Italian place downtown where entrees started at $30. August's birthday dinner. I'd called 3 times to confirm the reservation, had requested the corner table by the window, had even asked them about their wine list so I could sound knowledgeable when we ordered. The night before, August had texted me that Marcus needed help moving furniture and it was the only night he could do it. I'm really sorry, babe. I know you were excited, but Marcus is kind of desperate here. Can we reschedule? I'd said yes because I was understanding. Because I was supportive. Because good partners don't make their boyfriends choose between them and their friends. I'd eaten leftover soup from the diner that night, alone in this apartment, convincing myself that his friendship with Marcus was important, that I was being mature by not making a big deal about a missed reservation. Now I was holding evidence that he'd spent almost $150 at an upscale bar the same night he'd supposedly been hauling boxes and furniture. The same night I'd been eating 2-day-old soup and telling myself I was being reasonable. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and photographed the receipt. Not from sadness, from rage. Rage at him for lying so casually. But also rage at myself for being so willing to believe, so eager to be understanding, so desperate to avoid being called dramatic or insecure or paranoid. This wasn't just evidence of his lies. This was evidence of my complicity in my own diminishment. Every time I'd swallowed my doubt, every time I'd talked myself out of trusting my instincts, every time I'd chosen to believe him over believing myself, I'd been participating in my own erasure. I added the receipt to the box, right on top where it would be visible. The book sat on the shelf by the TV, Shoe Dog, The 4-Hour Workweek, Think and Grow Rich. All purchased because August had gone through a phase of wanting to really focus on personal development and learn from successful people. All pristine. All unread. The bookmarks I'd carefully placed still marked page 1 in each of them. Into the box they went. I stood back and looked at what I'd assembled. The box was full now, overflowing with physical evidence of 3.5 years of emotional fraud. Every item was a monument to me trying to fix what was fundamentally broken, trying to fill the space where a partner should have been standing, trying to love someone into becoming the person they'd promised they'd be. I grabbed the packing tape from the kitchen junk drawer and sealed the box. The sound of the tape gun was sharp and final in the quiet apartment, like a judge's gavel coming down. With a black permanent marker, I wrote across the top in capital letters that took up the entire surface. For August, since he's staying the night. Clara. I stepped back and stared at those words. My mother's voice echoed in my head from 2 years ago when she'd visited for Thanksgiving. She'd sat at this same kitchen table in the morning, drinking instant coffee because our machine was broken, watching August sleep until noon while I got ready for my shift at the diner. Baby, she'd said quietly, her voice careful like she was approaching a wounded animal. Love isn't supposed to feel like you're the only one rowing the boat. I'd gotten defensive immediately. Listed all of August's good qualities. Explained how he just needed time and support to find his path. Told her she didn't understand how hard it was to build a life in this economy, that not everyone had the same opportunities, that I was choosing to be his partner through the difficult times so we could celebrate together when things got better. She hadn't argued. Just kissed my forehead and said, "I hope you're right, sweetheart." Now standing in my apartment holding a box full of broken promises and wasted money, her words felt less like gentle concern and more like prophecy. My phone buzzed. The rideshare was 2 minutes away. I grabbed my coat and picked up the box. It was heavy, not from weight but from everything it represented. 3.5 years of me shrinking myself to make room for someone who'd been taking up all the space and giving nothing back. As I headed for the door, I caught my reflection in the mirror by the entrance. Still in my diner uniform. Hair falling out of its ponytail. Exhaustion written across my face. But my eyes looked different. Harder. Clearer. I wasn't worried anymore. I wasn't anxious or trying to convince myself things would improve if I just tried harder. For the first time in 3 years I was doing something entirely for myself. And it felt like the first honest breath I'd taken in forever. The car pulled up 30 seconds after I walked outside. A silver sedan with a dent in the passenger door and an air freshener that smelled like artificial pine. The driver was a quiet man in his 40s with tired eyes and a Seahawks cap, the kind of person who'd probably been driving all night and would keep driving until dawn. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror as I slid into the back seat with the box, but he didn't ask questions. Just nodded when I gave him the address. Riverside Towers. You know it. Yeah, I know it. His voice was neutral, professional. He pulled away from the curb and the familiar streets of my neighborhood disappeared behind us. I settled the box on my lap, my arms wrapped around it like I was protecting something valuable instead of delivering evidence of my own foolishness. My reflection stared back at me from the window, jaw set, eyes dry, posture rigid. The streetlights swept across my face in rhythmic intervals, and each time the light hit, I looked less like the woman who'd walked out of Rosewood Diner 3 hours ago and more like someone I'd never met before. I barely recognized her. And that felt exactly right. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, just past midnight on a Tuesday. We passed a gas station where a man was filling up a truck, a convenience store with flickering neon signs, a bus stop where someone sat alone scrolling through their phone. Normal people living normal nights, completely unaware that my entire world had just reorganized itself into before and after. I knew Sienna's address because August had mentioned it exactly once, about 6 months ago. We'd been eating takeout Chinese on the couch. I'd paid like always, and he'd been scrolling through his phone when he suddenly said, "Sienna's place is insane. Corner unit on the 15th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows. She's really got it made." The tone in his voice had caught my attention even then. Not admiration exactly. Longing. The way someone talks about a life they want for themselves, a life they think they deserve but can't quite reach. I'd felt something twist in my stomach but pushed it down. Told myself I was being insecure. Told myself he was just making conversation. Told myself all the things women tell themselves when they know something's wrong but aren't ready to face it yet. Now that memory felt like evidence I'd been collecting without realizing it. The driver caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "You okay back there?" "Yeah." My voice came out stronger than I expected. First time in a long time actually. He nodded like he understood something I hadn't said out loud, and we drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence. Riverside Towers materialized out of the darkness like something from a different city, a different life. All glass and steel and manufactured luxury, the kind of building that screamed, successful young professional, even though everyone inside was probably drowning in student loans and credit card debt just like the rest of us. The only difference was the facade. The lobby glowed warm and golden through floor-to-ceiling windows. I could see the doorman at his desk, a decorative fig tree in a concrete planter, abstract art on the walls that probably cost more than my car. "This is good," I said, and the driver pulled up to the main entrance. "You need help with that box?" "No. I've got it. Thanks." I paid through the app, added a generous tip because he'd given me silence when I needed it, and stepped out onto the pristine sidewalk. The door closed behind me with a soft click and the car pulled away, leaving me alone with my box and my resolve. The lobby doors were locked, but through the glass I could see the doorman, mid-20s, bored expression, scrolling through his phone. I knocked on the glass and he looked up, annoyed at being interrupted. He walked over and cracked the door open. "Can I help you?" "I'm delivering something to a friend. Sienna Brennan. 15G. He looked at me, diner uniform, messy ponytail, cardboard box with a name written in permanent marker, and I could see him deciding whether I was legitimate or some kind of problem he'd have to deal with. Whatever he saw in my face must have convinced him I wasn't worth the effort because he just shrugged and waved me in. "Elevators are on the right." "Thanks." The lobby was exactly as pretentious as I'd imagined. Marble floors that clicked under my worn sneakers. A chandelier that probably cost more than I made in a year. A seating area with leather chairs that no one ever sat in because this wasn't the kind of building where neighbors talked to each other. I walked to the elevators and pressed the up button. My reflection appeared in the polished steel doors, harsh and unflattering under the bright lights. The woman looking back at me had worked herself nearly to death for someone who couldn't even pretend to appreciate it. Dark circles under her eyes. Grease stains on her uniform that wouldn't come out no matter how many times she washed it. Hands that were dry and cracked from constant washing and sanitizer. But her jaw was set. Her eyes were clear. Her spine was straight. The elevator dinged and the doors slid open. The ride up felt like it took forever and no time at all. The elevator was all mirrors. Ceiling, walls, even the handrails were polished to a reflective shine. Everywhere I looked, I saw myself holding this box, and I watched my reflection like I was watching a character in a movie. Someone brave. Someone done with being lied to. Someone who'd finally chosen herself. My heart pounded as the numbers climbed. Not from fear or sadness, but from something else entirely. Anticipation. The satisfaction of finally taking action instead of just accepting whatever August decided to hand me. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 15th floor, and the doors opened onto a hallway that smelled like expensive candles and fresh paint. The carpet was plush under my feet, the lighting soft and indirect. Apartment doors lined both sides, each one identical except for the brushed steel numbers. I found 15G at the end of the hall. Corner unit, just like August had said. I wondered how many times he'd been here, how many lies he'd told to explain away his absences, how many times I'd believed him because believing was easier than facing the truth. I set the box down directly in front of her door and straightened my shoulders. Then I knocked 3 times. Loud. Deliberate. The kind of knocking that says I'm not going away until you answer. I heard movement inside. Footsteps approaching. A pause, probably looking through the peephole. Then the sound of locks turning. The door opened. Sienna stood there in yoga pants and an oversized cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my weekly paycheck. Her hair fell in those perfectly imperfect waves around her shoulders, the kind that takes 20 minutes of careful work to look casual. She held a wine glass in one hand, red wine half empty, and her expression cycled through emotions faster than I could name them. Confusion first. Then recognition. Then something that looked an awful lot like guilt trying to hide behind a forced smile. Clara. Her voice came out uncertain, like she couldn't quite believe I was standing in her hallway. What are you? I didn't let her finish. These belong to August. My voice came out steady and cold, nothing like the woman who used to apologize for taking up space. Since he's staying here tonight, I thought you should have them. You know, for convenience. Her face drained of color. The wine glass trembled in her hand, the red liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. He's not. I don't know what you think is happening, but... The words tumbled out defensive and panicked. Exactly how someone sounds when they're caught in a lie they haven't prepared for. I watched her scramble for an explanation, watched her eyes dart to the box and then back to my face, watched her try to calculate how much I knew and how she could spin this. I pulled out my phone with deliberate slowness, brought up the photo of the Tavern and tap receipt, and held it inches from her face. 3 weeks ago, I said, my voice level and factual like I was presenting evidence in court. $147 for drinks and appetizers. The same night he told me he was helping Marcus move furniture and couldn't make our dinner reservation, the one I'd saved 2 months of tips to afford. Sienna's eyes widened as she looked at the receipt. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Funny thing, I continued. I called Marcus yesterday about something completely unrelated. He hasn't moved in 2 years. Owns the same apartment. Same furniture. Everything exactly where it's always been. I watched the realization wash over her face. The understanding that she'd been lied to just as thoroughly as I had. The calculation happening behind her eyes as she tried to figure out what else might not be true. I don't want explanations, I said, feeling a strange power in my own calmness. I don't want apologies or excuses or whatever story you've been told. I just want you to understand something very clearly. He's been lying to both of us. Maybe to others too. I don't know and I don't care anymore. But now he's your problem. Congratulations on your prize. I turned and walked back toward the elevator before she could respond, my spine straight and my head high. Behind me I heard her voice, wait, or maybe Clara please, but I didn't turn around. The elevator doors opened like they'd been waiting for me. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, I caught one last glimpse of Sienna standing in her doorway, wine glass forgotten in her hand, staring at the box with August's name written across the top in permanent marker. The chapter closed with those elevator doors. Everything that had happened in that hallway, in that relationship, in those 3.5 years of carrying someone who'd never planned to walk beside me, all of it sealed away behind polished steel. And I didn't look back. The rideshare driver who picked me up from Riverside Towers was different from the first one. A woman in her 50s who asked if I was okay the second I got in the car. I must have looked like I'd just committed a crime or survived one. Maybe both. I'm fine, I said, and the strange thing was I meant it. Better than fine, actually. She nodded like she understood something I hadn't explained and didn't ask any more questions. We drove through empty streets back to my neighborhood, past closed storefronts and flickering streetlights, and I watched the city pass by the window feeling lighter than I had in years. When I got home, I stood in the doorway of my apartment for a long moment before stepping inside. The same space I'd left an hour ago, but everything felt different now. The air felt cleaner. The silence felt peaceful instead of oppressive. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, closing my eyes, letting the weight of what I'd just done settle into my bones. I'd delivered a box full of broken promises to another woman's doorstep at midnight. I'd confronted her with evidence of August's lies. I'd walked away without apologies or explanations. And I felt absolutely, perfectly calm. I peeled off my diner uniform that still smelled like fryer grease and coffee, balled it up, and threw it in the hamper with more force than necessary. In my dresser, buried under winter sweaters I hadn't worn in years, I found an old college t-shirt from a music festival I'd gone to before I met August. Before I'd learned to make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's ego. I pulled it on and it felt like putting on a version of myself I'd forgotten existed. The shower was hot enough to turn my skin pink, and I stood under the water longer than I should have, watching the day circle the drain. When I finally got out, I made chamomile tea in the mug my mother had given me, the one with the chip on the rim that August always complained about but I refused to throw away. I carried it to the couch, wrapped myself in the blanket from the back of the sofa and sat down to wait. Because I knew what was coming. Part of me, the part that was tired and just wanted to sleep, considered turning off my phone. But a larger part, the part that had been silenced and dismissed and gaslit for 3 years, needed to see his reaction. Needed to watch him scramble and panic and reveal exactly who he was when he lost control of the narrative. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and distant sirens somewhere outside my window. Normal city sounds. Comforting in their ordinariness. I sipped my tea and felt strangely peaceful, like I was watching a storm approach from behind thick glass. Dangerous and chaotic out there but completely unable to touch me in here. My phone sat on the coffee table, screen dark and silent. I stared at it like I was waiting for a bomb to detonate. At 4:02 a.m. it finally did. The screen lit up with a text notification, and even from where I sat I could see the all-caps aggression of it. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I picked up the phone, unlocked it and watched as more messages poured in before I could even finish reading the first one. "You showed up at Sienna's? Are you fucking insane? You embarrassed me. You embarrassed her. What kind of psycho does that? Answer your phone. Now." I set the phone back down and took another sip of tea, watching the screen light up again and again as more messages arrived. Each one more unhinged than the last. There was something darkly satisfying about it. Watching him lose control, watching the careful mask he'd worn for 3 years slip completely off to reveal the entitled, manipulative person underneath. My phone started ringing. August's name and photo. Him smiling at a barbecue last summer, looking charming and harmless, filled the screen. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Immediately it started ringing again. I declined the call and watched another text appear. "Pick up the phone." Then another. "We need to talk about this like adults." Then another. "You're acting crazy and you need to calm down." I opened my screenshots folder and started methodically documenting everything. Each text. Each missed call. The timestamps. His escalating rage captured in digital evidence that couldn't be denied or rewritten later. By 4:30 a.m. he'd sent 14 messages and called 6 times. I hadn't responded to any of it and I could feel his panic growing with each ignored attempt at contact. The tone of his messages started shifting, rage giving way to something more desperate. "Clara, please. We need to talk. You can't just do this. I know you're upset but this is extreme. Just give me a chance to explain." I almost laughed at that last one. Explain what? How his wallet that he claimed to have lost was sitting in his nightstand drawer. How the receipt from Tavern and Tap proved he'd lied about helping Marcus. How he was spending the night at another woman's apartment while texting me not to worry. What explanation could possibly make any of that okay? My tea had gone cold. I got up to make another cup, and while the water heated, I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the city starting to wake up. Streetlights were beginning to look pale against the coming dawn. A garbage truck rumbled down the street. Someone's car alarm went off and then stopped. The ordinary world continuing on, completely unaware that mine had just reorganized itself into before and after. My phone buzzed again on the coffee table. I ignored it and poured hot water over a fresh tea bag, watching the color seep out and cloud the water. When I sat back down, there were 3 new messages. The tone had shifted again. This time to the strategy I'd seen August deploy dozens of times over the years when he was backed into a corner. Manipulation disguised as vulnerability. Lies wrapped in the language of apology. Look, I'm sorry. I wasn't even there. I lied about staying at Sienna's. I was actually at my brother's place. We had a fight and I panicked. I didn't want to burden you with more stress. Please, call me. We can fix this. I know I messed up, but we're stronger than this. I read it 3 times. Not because I believed a single word, I didn't. But because it revealed something important about how little he thought of me, how thoroughly he underestimated my intelligence. Even caught. Even exposed with physical evidence of his lies. He was still lying. Just with a different story now. A slightly more palatable version that he thought I might accept because accepting it would be easier than facing the full truth of his betrayal. He actually believed I was so desperate to stay with him, so worn down by 3 years of gaslighting and financial abuse, that I'd swallow this new lie just to avoid the pain of ending things. The arrogance of it lit something cold and final in my chest. I set my phone down and opened my laptop. My hands moved with purpose, like they knew what needed to happen before my conscious mind had fully formed the thought. I logged into our phone account, the family plan where I'd been paying both our bills for the past year because he was between opportunities and needed to stay connected for networking. The account I paid for. The account that had both our phones listed. The account that tracked location data. I navigated to the location history and pulled up the past 30 days. What I found made my blood run cold and hot at the same time, like my body couldn't decide whether to shut down or catch fire. Multiple visits to Sienna's address, yes. Late nights. Hours-long stays. That was bad enough. But there was another pattern that stood out even more clearly once I started looking. The Grandview Inn. A cheap hotel on the north side of town, the kind of place with hourly rates and a parking lot you pulled into from the back. It appeared in his location history again and again and again. Sometimes multiple times a week. I opened the calendar on my phone. The one where I tracked everything because August never remembered anything unless it benefited him. I started cross-referencing dates. Every single visit to that hotel coincided with a night he'd claimed to be working late on a freelance project, or helping a friend with something urgent, or meeting potential clients for drinks. October 15th, Grandview Inn, 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. He told me he was working on a website design project with a tight deadline. October 8th, Grandview Inn, 8 p.m. to midnight. He'd said he was helping his friend Trevor with car trouble. September 29th, Grandview Inn, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. He'd claimed he was at a networking event for freelancers. The pattern went back weeks. Months probably if I scrolled further. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a one-time betrayal. This was systematic. Calculated. A double life maintained with careful precision and casual lies told to someone he assumed would never be smart enough or suspicious enough to check. My hands shook as I took screenshots of everything. The dates. The times. The locations. The GPS coordinates that spelled out his deception in data that couldn't be argued with or explained away. This wasn't just cheating. This was something darker. Something that revealed exactly how much contempt he had for me, how thoroughly he'd been playing me for a fool while I worked myself to exhaustion to support us both. The sun was starting to rise outside my window, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. My phone buzzed again with another message from August, but I didn't look at it. I had everything I needed now. And I was done waiting for him to tell me the truth. I stared at the screenshots on my laptop screen until the sun came up fully, the pale morning light turning my apartment from gray to gold. The location data didn't change no matter how many times I looked at it. The pattern remained the same. The evidence of his systematic deception stayed exactly where it was, undeniable and damning. At 7:15 a.m. as the city woke up outside my window, car doors slamming, someone's dog barking, the coffee shop on the corner opening its metal gate, I opened a new text message. My hands were completely steady as I typed. I know about Sienna. I know about the Grandview Inn. I know about the $147 you spent at Tavern and Tap when you said you were helping Marcus. I know you're lying right now about being at your brother's. Your location history says you're still at Sienna's building. I know everything, August. You're free. So am I. I attached 3 screenshots. The location data showing his repeated visits to both Sienna's apartment and the hotel. The photo of the Tavern and Tap receipt. The pattern of lies mapped out in GPS coordinates and timestamps that couldn't be explained away or rewritten. Then I hit send. For about 30 seconds I sat there staring at my phone, waiting for the 3 dots that would show he was typing a response. Waiting for the next lie, the next manipulation, the next attempt to make me doubt what I could see with my own eyes. But I didn't wait long. Before he could respond, I blocked his number. The action felt final and satisfying, like closing a door that had been hanging open for years, letting in cold air and unwanted visitors. But I didn't stop there. I opened every app, every platform, every possible avenue of contact we'd ever used. Instagram, blocked. Facebook, blocked. Snapchat, blocked. Even Venmo, where he'd sent me payment requests he never intended to fulfill, blocked. With each one I felt lighter. Like I was deleting weight from my shoulders, erasing his access to me one platform at a time. By the time I was done, it was 7:45 a.m. I made coffee, real coffee, not the instant stuff I usually settled for, and called a locksmith. The first one couldn't come until tomorrow. The second one had an opening at 11. I'll take it, I said. By noon, a man named Eddie with a tool belt and kind eyes had changed both locks on my apartment door. He didn't ask why I needed it done so urgently on a Wednesday morning. Just did the work, handed me 2 new keys and told me to have a good day. August's old key no longer opened my door. That felt more significant than it probably should have. The next 2 days passed in a strange bubble of calm that I didn't quite trust. I went to work at Rosewood Diner like always, but everything felt different. I smiled at customers and the smiles felt real instead of performed. I poured coffee and didn't spill it because my hands weren't shaking with exhaustion or anxiety. I collected my tips and put them in my pocket instead of an envelope marked for someone else's bills. Janelle noticed something had changed. She cornered me by the coffee station during the lunch rush on Thursday and studied my face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Did you get your hair cut?" she asked. "No." "Same hair." "New makeup." "Same makeup." "Actually, no makeup." She tilted her head, still trying to figure it out. "Something's different." "Look, I don't know." "Taller." I laughed at that. "I'm the same height I've always been. Not physically taller. Just, like you take up more space or something." She grabbed the coffee pot I was holding and filled it from the machine. "It's a good look on you. Keep it." I realized later what she meant. I'd stopped apologizing for existing. Stopped making myself smaller to accommodate everyone else's comfort. Stopped shrinking back when someone needed to get past me, or when a customer was rude, or when another waitress wanted the better section. I'd started standing up straight and making eye contact and saying, "Excuse me," instead of "sorry," when someone was in my way. On Thursday evening I made dinner in my quiet apartment. Nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs and toast, but I set the table like it mattered. Used a real plate instead of eating out of the pan. Poured water into an actual glass instead of drinking from the tap. Small things. But they felt like reclaiming something I'd lost without noticing. I was halfway through eating when my phone rang. Unknown number. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. I'd been getting a few calls from numbers I didn't recognize, probably August trying to get through the blocks I'd put up. But something made me answer. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the confidence of knowing I could hang up whenever I wanted. "Hello. Clara." A woman's voice. "Kiki. Kitten. This is Sienna." My entire body went rigid. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth and I set it down carefully on my plate, suddenly not hungry anymore. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me," she continued quickly, like she was afraid I'd hang up before she could get the words out. "And I completely understand if you just want to tell me to leave you alone. But I need to tell you something. You deserve to know." I should have hung up. Should have blocked this number too and gone back to my eggs and my quiet evening and my new life without August in it. But I didn't. "I'm listening," I said. I heard her take a breath, like she was steadying herself. After you left that night. After I saw the box and the receipt and everything you said. I confronted August. He tried to deny it at first. Said you were being crazy, that you'd always been jealous and insecure, that you were making things up because you couldn't handle the breakup. My jaw clenched at that. Even now, even caught, he was trying to paint me as the problem. But I pushed him, Sienna continued. I showed him the receipt photo you'd shown me. Asked him to explain it. And eventually he admitted things. Her voice cracked slightly. Clara, I had no idea you two were still together. He told me you'd broken up 6 months ago. He said you were just roommates trying to figure out the lease situation, that you were friends but it was over romantically. He talked about you like someone he cared about but had grown apart from. Not like someone he was actively lying to and living with. The room felt too small suddenly. Too warm. I got up and opened the window, letting in the cool October air and the sounds of the city below. I believed him, Sienna said, and now she was crying. I believed him because he seemed so sincere. Because he told me about how hard the breakup had been but how mature you both were being about it. Because he showed me texts that made it sound like you two were just coordinating bills and apartment stuff. I never would have. I'm not that person, Clara. I don't go after men who are in relationships. But he made me think there was no relationship to go after. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction at her distress. Wanted to say something cruel about her being naive or stupid. But I couldn't. Because I heard myself in her voice. The shock of realizing you'd been lied to, the shame of having believed someone who was playing you, the anger at yourself for not seeing it sooner. We'd both been manipulated by the same person. Both told carefully crafted lies designed specifically for us. Both made to feel like we were special, chosen, the one he really wanted. Thank you for telling me, I said, because I didn't know what else to say. There's more, Sienna said, her voice dropping even lower. I haven't been able to stop thinking about this. About what else he might have lied about. And I kept thinking about that hotel you mentioned, the Grandview Inn. The name looked familiar, like I'd seen it somewhere before. My stomach dropped even though I was standing still. I went through old texts, she continued. From back in July. He'd mentioned meeting someone there for a business thing. I remember thinking it was a weird place for a business meeting, but he said the person he was meeting preferred somewhere low-key. I didn't push it. I closed my eyes, already knowing where this was going. Yesterday I called the hotel. I made up a story about thinking I'd left my credit card there and wanting to check if they'd found it. I got transferred to the bar manager. And Clara, there's someone else. The words hung in the air like smoke. A bartender who works at the hotel restaurant. Her name is Rachel. The manager let it slip when I was asking about the date I'd been there. He said something like, "Oh, that would have been Rachel's shift. She would remember if someone left a card because she's really careful about that stuff." And then he said, Sienna's voice broke. He said, August's girlfriend is always really on top of things like that. The room tilted sideways. I gripped the windowsill to steady myself. I played dumb. Asked who August was. And the manager got all flustered, realized he'd said too much. But he confirmed that August is a regular there. That he and Rachel have been seeing each other. At least 4 months, Clara. Maybe longer. I couldn't breathe right. The air felt too thick. After I hung up, I did more digging, Sienna said. I have a friend who knows people who work there. She made some calls. Clara, he's been juggling at least 3 of us. You, me, and Rachel. Maybe more. Each of us thinking we were the only one. Each of us being lied to in exactly the way we'd be most likely to believe. My eggs sat cold and congealing on the plate. My apartment felt different suddenly, not peaceful but exposed. Like I'd been living in a house with glass walls and everyone could see and accept me. Sienna kept talking, explaining what else she'd learned, how the timeline matched up, how August had been managing multiple relationships with the precision of someone who'd done this before. But her voice sounded distant now. When we finally hung up 20 minutes later, I stood at my window staring out at the street below. At the ordinary world continuing on. At people walking dogs and getting in cars and living their normal lives with their normal problems. I'd thought finding his wallet was the revelation. Thought delivering the box to Sienna's door was the climax. Thought blocking him and changing my locks was the ending. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't a boyfriend who'd made a mistake or had a moment of weakness. This was someone who'd been living multiple lives simultaneously, telling each woman exactly what she needed to hear. manufacturing crises and explanations and excuses with the skill of someone who'd perfected the art of deception. And I'd been so tired, so beaten down by working myself to death to support us both, that I'd never seen it. I stood there until the sun set and the street lights came on, trying to figure out who I'd been sharing my life with for 3.5 years. Trying to figure out if I'd ever really known him at all. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with every drawer and filing cabinet in my apartment opened, pulling out papers I'd saved without really knowing why. Receipts I'd shoved in coat pockets. Bank statements I'd filed away. Text message screenshots I'd taken during arguments when August had denied saying things I knew he'd said. 3.5 years of evidence I didn't realize I'd been collecting. By the time the sun came up Friday morning, my kitchen table was covered in organized stacks. Bank statements. Venmo transaction histories. Receipts for gifts. Text conversations. A timeline I'd constructed on notebook paper with dates and amounts and broken promises laid out in chronological order. The number at the bottom made my stomach hurt. $4,300. That was just the money I could prove with documentation. The actual amount was probably higher. Cash I'd given him that left no paper trail, meals I'd paid for without keeping receipts, utilities and groceries that came out of my account month after month while he contributed nothing. I made coffee and stared at the evidence spread across my table. It looked different in the morning light. Not like memories anymore. Like a case file. At 9 o'clock I called Jordan. We'd gone to community college together 5 years ago. Both of us trying to figure out what we wanted to be, both of us working part-time jobs to pay for classes. He'd figured it out, got into tech, now worked for some startup downtown doing something with data that I didn't fully understand, but that paid him enough to live alone in a decent apartment. I'd gotten stuck at Rosewood Diner and stayed stuck. Clara? Everything okay? His voice sounded concerned. I didn't usually call him this early. Can you meet me for coffee? I need advice. Yeah, of course. When? I'm on my lunch break at noon. The diner. I'll be there. The morning shift dragged. Every customer seemed to need something. More coffee, extra cream, their eggs remade because they were too runny or not runny enough. Janelle kept giving me concerned looks but didn't ask questions, which I appreciated. At noon, Jordan showed up in his usual hoodie and jeans, looking exactly like he always did except his sneakers were new and probably cost more than my weekly paycheck. He slid into the booth in the back corner, the one the staff used for breaks, and I brought over 2 coffees in the folder I'd prepared. So what's going on? He asked. You sounded stressed on the phone. I set the folder on the table between us. I broke up with August. His eyebrows shot up. Finally. What happened? I gave him the short version. The text about the lost wallet that wasn't lost, finding evidence of him staying at Sienna's place, the other women, the systematic lying. Jordan's expression shifted from surprise to anger to something that looked like he wanted to say, I told you so, but was holding back. Good, he finally said. He was always a user, Clara. I'm glad you saw it. There's more, I said and pushed the folder toward him. The money part. He opened it and started reading. I watched his face as he went through the bank statements, the Venmo transactions with their optimistic notes. Car repair emergency. Investment opportunity, will pay you back Friday. Temporary loan until my check clears. None of which had ever been repaid. Jesus, Clara, Jordan said softly. He looked up at me. This is over $4,000. 4,300, I said. That's just what I can prove. The actual amount is higher. He kept flipping through pages. Text messages where August had promised repayment. My bank statements showing rent payments for 18 straight months with no contribution from him despite living in my apartment. Receipts for gifts I'd bought him. Birthday presents, Christmas presents, just because presents, that added up to thousands more. Clara, Jordan said carefully, setting down the folder. You know you can file a small claims case for this, right? This isn't just you helping your boyfriend. This is fraud. You have documentation. The word hit me like cold water. Fraud. I'd been calling it helping. Supporting. Being a good partner. August had called it borrowing from someone who loves him, temporary loans, investments in our shared future. The law apparently called it something else entirely. I didn't even know that was an option, I admitted. You can absolutely do this, Jordan said. Small claims court is designed for exactly this kind of situation. The limit is like 10,000 in this state, so you're well under that. And you have evidence for everything. That's the hard part, and you've already done it. He pulled out his phone and started typing. I know someone. A lawyer friend. Well, friend of a friend who does consultations. Her name's Ms. Vance. Let me see if she has any openings this week. Jordan, I can't afford a lawyer. Consultations are free. And honestly, for something this clear-cut, you probably don't even need one. But she can help you file correctly. Make sure you don't miss anything. He looked up from his phone. You deserve to get this money back, Clara. He stole from you. That word felt too strong. But looking at the evidence spread between us, I couldn't argue with it. Jordan got me an appointment for Saturday morning. Ms. Vance's office was above a used bookstore downtown, up a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. The door at the top had frosted glass with her name painted in gold letters that were starting to peel. She answered on my second knock. A woman in her 50s with gray hair cut short, sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses, and a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of my high school math teacher. The kind of person who didn't tolerate excuses or bullshit. You must be Clara. Jordan said you'd be coming. Come in, sit. Her office was small but organized. Bookshelves full of legal texts, a desk covered in neat stacks of papers, 2 chairs facing each other with a small table between them. It smelled like old paper and coffee. I sat down and handed her the folder I'd prepared. She opened it without small talk and started reading. I watched her face as she went through everything. Professional neutrality at first. She'd probably seen hundreds of cases like this. But as she kept reading, her expression shifted. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes narrowed. By the time she got to the text messages where August had promised repayment, next week, over and over again for 18 months, she looked genuinely angry. Clara, she said after 20 minutes, setting down the folder. This is one of the most clear-cut cases of financial exploitation I've seen in years. You have documentation for everything. The loans with explicit promises of repayment. The shared expenses he never contributed to despite living with you. The pattern of deception laid out in his own words. She pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. In small claims court, you don't even need a lawyer. You can represent yourself with this evidence and you'd win. But I want to help you file correctly. Make sure you don't miss anything. Because I've seen too many women lose money to men who think kindness is the same as being stupid. Her words hit something deep inside me. My eyes burned and I felt tears threatening for the first time since this whole thing started. Not sad tears. Angry tears. Validating tears. Tears that said someone finally believed me without me having to prove or explain or justify. How long will it take? Asked my voice rough. She smiled, not a happy smile but a determined one. We can file by the end of the week. Court date will probably be 4 to 6 weeks out. You'll need to serve him papers which we can arrange. And then you show up with this evidence and let him try to explain it away. What if he doesn't show up? Then you win by default. Either way, Clara, you're getting your money back. I left her office an hour later with a plan, a timeline, and the first real hope I'd felt since finding August's wallet in his drawer. Ms. Vance walked me to the door and squeezed my shoulder. You're doing the right thing, she said. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty about it. I walked down the creaky stairs and out onto the street, blinking in the afternoon sunlight. The bookstore below had its door propped open and classical music drifted out. A couple walked past holding hands. A kid rode by on a skateboard. The ordinary world continuing on while mine reorganized itself into something I could finally control. I was halfway home when I saw Mrs. Delgado at the base of our building's front steps, struggling with grocery bags. She was 72, had lived in apartment 2B for 30 years, and had been widowed for a decade. I'd helped her before, carrying things, fixing her computer, explaining how to use her phone, and she always insisted on paying me back with food or coffee or advice I didn't know I needed. Mrs. Delgado let me help. She looked up, her face breaking into a relieved smile. Clara. Thank you, Mija. These bags get heavier every year. I carried them up 3 flights of stairs. She had the same bad elevator I did and she invited me in for coffee. Her apartment smelled like cinnamon and old books, and photos of her grandchildren covered every surface. The furniture was worn but cared for and everything had a place. She made coffee in a percolator that was probably older than me, and we sat at her small kitchen table. She asked about work, about my week, and I found myself telling her everything. Not the legal details but the emotional truth. The lies. The betrayal. The other women. The money. The decision to fight back instead of just walk away quietly. She listened without interrupting, nodding in the right places, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "You seem different lately, Mija," she said when I finished. "Lighter. Like you put down something heavy you'd been carrying too long." "I feel different," I admitted. "Stronger maybe. Or just less tired." She reached across the table and took my hand. "My Roberto, he was a good man. We had 43 years together before the cancer took him. But before Roberto, I wasted 3 years on someone who made me small. Someone who took and called it love." I squeezed her hand, waiting. The day I left him, my mother said something I never forgot. She said, "Mija, sometimes the worst people teach us the most important thing, that we're stronger than we knew." Mrs. Delgado's eyes were bright with tears and wisdom. "You're learning that now. And one day you'll look back and realize that man didn't break you. He just showed you what you were capable of surviving." Her words settled into my chest like a blessing. Like permission to be angry and sad and strong all at the same time. I stayed for another hour, drinking coffee and listening to stories about her life. When I finally left, she hugged me at the door. "You're going to be okay, Clara. Better than okay." Walking back to my own apartment, I believed her. Ms. Vance filed the paperwork on a Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after our meeting. She called me that evening while I was at work to confirm everything had gone through. "You're officially filed," she said over the phone. I could hear papers shuffling in the background. "Court date is November 14th. 9 in the morning. You'll need to be there 30 minutes early." November 14th. 6 weeks away. It felt like forever and not long enough at the same time. "What happens now?" I asked, stepping into the back alley behind the diner where the signal was better and no one could overhear. "Now we wait. The court will serve him papers within the next week. He'll have time to respond, get a lawyer if he wants one, prepare his defense. And then you show up with your evidence and let the judge decide." After we hung up, I stood in the alley for a few minutes, breathing in the cool October air mixed with the smell of fryer grease from the kitchen vents. 6 weeks of waiting. 6 weeks of knowing he knew I was coming for him. The thought should have made me anxious. Instead, it made me feel purposeful. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange new rhythm. I kept working at the diner, kept pouring coffee and taking orders and collecting tips. But something fundamental had shifted in how I moved through the world. When Janelle asked me to cover her Saturday shift, my only day off that week, I said no. Just no, without the apologetic explanation I usually attach to it. She looked surprised but didn't push. When a customer snapped his fingers at me for a refill, I walked past him to help the table I was already assisting, then circled back when I was ready. The old me would have jumped immediately, apologizing for not being faster. I started meal prepping on Sunday afternoons. Chicken and rice and vegetables portioned into containers for the week. No more gas station sandwiches eaten in my car between shifts. No more skipping meals to save money for August's emergencies. I slept with my windows open even though it made the apartment cold. The city sounds, cars passing, people talking, distant sirens, someone's music playing too loud, used to keep me awake. Now they felt like companionship. Proof that the world was continuing on and I was part of it. Small changes. But they added up to something bigger. I was learning to take up space in my own life again. August tried to reach me. Not directly, he couldn't, I'd blocked him everywhere, but through other people. Marcus called one evening while I was folding laundry. "Hey. Listen, August wanted me to reach out." "No," I said, cutting him off. "Just hear me out. He feels really bad about everything. He knows he messed up. He just wants a chance to explain, to apologize properly. Marcus will talk in court. With a judge present and documentation ready. That's the only conversation I'm interested in having." Silence on the other end. Then, I get it. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. He owes you that money." "He does," I agreed and hung up. November 14th arrived cold and bright. The kind of autumn morning where your breath comes out in clouds and the sun is sharp and unforgiving. I'd taken the day off work, told my manager I had a medical appointment, which wasn't technically true but felt close enough to honest. I put on the one professional outfit I owned, black pants and a white blouse I'd bought 2 years ago for a job interview at a bank that never called me back. The pants were a little loose now. I'd lost weight over the past month without trying, probably from stress or from actually eating regular meals instead of whatever was cheapest. I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early like Ms. Vance had instructed. The building was exactly what I'd expected. Institutional and impersonal, all fluorescent lights and scuffed linoleum floors and plastic chairs bolted to the ground. People sat scattered throughout the waiting area looking anxious or angry or resigned to their fates. I found a seat near the window and pulled out my folder of evidence, even though I'd already reviewed it a dozen times. The receipts. The bank statements. The text messages. The timeline I'd constructed showing 3.5 years of broken promises. Clara. I looked up. Ms. Vance was walking toward me in a gray suit, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen better decades. "You ready?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Good. Remember, speak clearly, stick to the facts, let the evidence do the heavy lifting. The judge has seen your documentation already. This is just formality at this point." I nodded, my stomach tight with nerves that felt different from anxiety. More like anticipation. That's when I saw him. August walked through the main doors with someone I didn't recognize. A woman in her 30s with blonde hair and an expensive-looking coat, touching his arm in that possessive way I'd seen before. On Sienna. On me, probably back when I'd thought he was mine. Not Sienna. Not Rachel from the hotel. Someone new. Or someone old I'd never known about. He was wearing a button-down shirt I'd never seen, dark jeans, shoes that looked recently polished. Like he'd dressed up for court. Like he thought looking presentable would somehow erase what he'd done. When he spotted me, his face did something complicated. Surprise melting into anger, then something that might have been shame, then settling into a forced neutrality that didn't reach his eyes. I held his gaze. Didn't look away. Didn't smile or frown or give him anything to read. After a few seconds he was the one who broke eye contact. The woman with him whispered something in his ear and he nodded, and they sat on the opposite side of the waiting area. She kept glancing at me like she was trying to figure out who I was and why I mattered. Good luck with that, I thought. You'll figure it out eventually. Or you won't and he'll move on to the next one. Clara Martinez? A clerk called my name from the doorway. I stood, grabbed my folder and followed Ms. Vance into the courtroom. It was smaller than I'd imagined. More like a conference room than the dramatic courtrooms you see on TV. The judge sat at an elevated desk at the front, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and reading glasses on a chain. There was a table for me and Ms. Vance on one side, another table on the other side where August and his lawyer would sit. August came in a minute later with a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Young, maybe fresh out of law school, shuffling papers with the energy of someone who hadn't prepared adequately. The proceedings started quickly. The judge reviewed the case summary, asked if both parties were present, then turned to me. "Ms. Martinez, you're claiming the defendant owes you $4,300 in unpaid loans. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you have documentation?" "Yes, Your Honor." I opened my folder and Ms. Vance helped me present everything. The bank statements showing direct transfers to August's account with notes like, car repair loan, and temporary help until paycheck. The Venmo transactions with dates and descriptions. The text messages where he'd promised repayment next week over and over for months. The receipts for shared rent that I'd paid alone for 18 months while he lived in my apartment. The judge reviewed each piece carefully, making notes. Then she turned to August. "Mr. Reeves, do you dispute that you received this money from Ms. Martinez?" August's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges receiving financial support from Ms. Martinez during their relationship. However, he contends that this was mutual support between partners, not loans with repayment obligations. Does your client have any documentation showing his financial contributions to their shared household?" The lawyer shuffled his papers. "No, Your Honor, but does your client have any evidence that these transfers were intended as gifts rather than loans?" More shuffling. The nature of romantic relationships often involves. "I'll take that as a no." The judge looked back at the text messages, reading one out loud. "Thanks, babe, I'll pay you back as soon as my check clears next Friday." That was sent on March 12th. "Did that check clear, Mr. Reeves?" August shifted in his seat. "I had unexpected expenses." That's not what I asked. Did you repay Ms. Martinez as promised? No, but... Thank you. The judge made another note. She reviewed the evidence for another few minutes in silence while my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Finally, she looked up. The plaintiff has documented evidence of $4,300 in loans with explicit promises of repayment via text message. The defendant has provided no counter-evidence and no proof of contribution to shared household expenses he claims to have paid. This is straightforward breach of verbal contract with written documentation. She turned to August. Mr. Reeves, I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff. You are ordered to repay Ms. Martinez the full amount of $4,300, plus court fees of $287, for a total of $4,587. Payment plan options are available through the clerk's office. Do you understand? August's face had gone red. This is... Do you understand? The judge repeated, her voice sharp. Yes, he said through clenched teeth. Something cracked open in my chest. Not triumph exactly, something quieter but deeper. Vindication. Validation. The knowledge that I wasn't crazy, wasn't dramatic, wasn't making things up. I'd been right all along. As we filed out of the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in years. Ms. Vance squeezed my shoulder. Well done. He has 30 days to start payment or face additional penalties. Thank you, I said. For everything. You did the hard part. I just filed paperwork. I was walking toward my car in the parking lot when I heard footsteps behind me. Clara, wait. August's voice. I stopped, turned around. He'd left his new girlfriend at his car and jogged over to catch me. Up close he looked tired. Older somehow. I know you're angry, he said, slightly out of breath. I know I messed up. But did you really have to take this to court? Did you have to humiliate me like this? I stared at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time in 3 years I saw him clearly. Not the potential I'd kept projecting onto him. Not the man he'd promised he'd become, but exactly who he was. Someone who took and then resented you for noticing. I didn't humiliate you, August, I said, my voice steady and calm. I held you accountable. There's a difference. He opened his mouth to respond, but I was already turning away, already walking toward my car. Clara, he called after me. I didn't turn around. I got in my car, started the engine and drove home through afternoon traffic, feeling the weight of 3 years finally lifting off my shoulders. When I got back to my apartment, I stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking. The dripping faucet had been fixed. The bills were current. The couch was still secondhand and the apartment was still small, but it was mine. All mine. And that was enough. I stepped into my apartment and closed the door behind me, letting my back rest against it for a moment. The space looked exactly as I'd left it that morning. Small, modest, unchanged, but something felt fundamentally different. The dripping faucet was finally silent. I'd fixed it myself 2 weeks ago with a YouTube tutorial and a $20 part from the hardware store. The bills were stacked neatly on the counter, all current, all manageable. The couch was still secondhand with its ripped armrest, but it was mine. All mine. I set my purse down and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. People were getting off work, heading home, living their ordinary lives. The sun was starting to set, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. I felt something settle in my chest. Not happiness exactly, more like peace. The kind that comes from knowing you did the hard thing and survived it. 6 months passed like that. Quietly. Without drama or revelation or the kind of transformation you see in movies. I still worked at Rosewood Diner. Still poured coffee and took orders and dealt with customers who thought tipping was optional. Still came home with aching feet and grease stains that never quite washed out. Still struggled some months to make rent when the tips were bad or an unexpected expense came up. My apartment still had that one-bedroom light that flickered no matter how many bulbs I replaced. The elevator was still broken more often than it worked. The upstairs neighbors still fought about the same things at the same volume. But I was different. I started saying yes to things I'd always wanted to try. The community center 3 blocks away offered evening classes, and one Thursday I walked past and saw a flyer for pottery. Something about it pulled at me. The idea of making something with my hands that wasn't food someone would consume and forget, something that would last. August used to mock stuff like that. Called it hipster nonsense and a waste of money. Said I should focus on practical things like picking up extra shifts or learning skills that would help me get a better job. I signed up anyway. The class was small. 6 people, all women, all there for different reasons. The instructor was a retired teacher named Helen with clay permanently under her fingernails and a patience that felt infinite. She taught us to center the clay, to feel its resistance and work with it instead of against it. My first attempts were disasters. Lopsided bowls that collapsed. Mugs with handles that fell off. Vases that looked like they'd been made by a child. But Helen just smiled and said, "Try again. Clay is forgiving." By the 3rd class I made something that actually looked intentional. A small bowl, slightly uneven but functional. One evening Helen watched me work and said, "You throw like someone who's not afraid to mess up anymore." I looked up at her, hands covered in wet clay. "I've already survived the worst mess," I said. "This is nothing." She nodded like she understood something I hadn't said out loud. The money from the court judgment came in irregular installments. $200 here. $150 there. Always a few days before the deadline, like August was testing how close he could cut it without facing penalties. Always with the energy of someone being forced to do something rather than someone trying to make amends. I deposited each check without ceremony and transferred the money to a savings account I'd opened specifically for this. The first savings account I'd had in my adult life. I labeled it Clara's Future on the bank website, and every time I logged in and saw the balance growing even slowly, even in tiny increments, it felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen. Through Marcus, who I'd stayed friends with despite everything, maybe because he'd apologized for not seeing what was happening sooner, I heard updates about August's life. His new girlfriend had left him after 2 months. He was working part-time at a sporting goods store. He'd moved into a studio apartment on the north side that Marcus described as kind of depressing. "He's going through a hard time," Marcus said one evening when we met for coffee. I stirred sugar into my cup and felt absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction. Not sympathy. Not even curiosity about the details. "We all go through hard times," I said. "The difference is how you treat people when you do." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah. You're right." August had become what he always should have been. Someone from my past who taught me an important lesson. Not about love or relationships or trust, but about what I would and wouldn't accept. About the difference between supporting someone and being used by them. I didn't think about him much anymore. When I did, it was with the same emotional distance I'd feel remembering a bad restaurant or a movie I didn't like. A thing that happened. A mistake I wouldn't repeat. Spring came slowly the way it does in the city. A few warm days mixed in with cold ones, trees budding gradually, people starting to sit outside at coffee shops again. On a Saturday morning in late April, almost 9 months after the night I delivered that box to Sienna's door, I was sitting on my fire escape with coffee and a book when I heard Mrs. Delgado's voice from 2 floors below. "Mija. You up there?" I looked down. She was leaning out her window waving up at me. "Yeah, Mrs. Delgado. What's up?" "I'm making tamales. Come down and help me, these old hands need young energy." I laughed and climbed down the fire escape, letting myself in through her always unlocked window like I'd done a dozen times before. Her kitchen smelled like corn and spices and decades of family recipes. The counter was covered in ingredients. Corn husks soaking in a bowl, seasoned pork in one pot, masa in another. She handed me an apron and put me to work. "You spread the masa like this," she demonstrated, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Not too thick, not too thin. Then the filling. Then you fold like you're tucking in a baby." We worked side by side for hours, talking and laughing and listening to her old radio that only picked up Spanish stations. She told me stories about Roberto. Not the sanitized, romanticized version people tell about their dead spouses, but the real thing. The fights they'd had about money. The time he forgot their anniversary and she made him sleep on the couch for a week. The years it took them to really understand each other. "Love isn't what they show you in the movies, Mija," she said, pressing filling into a corn husk. "It's work. Every day you choose it. And both people have to be doing the choosing or it doesn't work." "The difference between Roberto and August," she continued, not looking up from her folding, "is that Roberto grew up and August never will. Some people are still waiting for life to accommodate them. Other people rise to meet life where it is." I thought about that as we worked, my hands learning the muscle memory of something her mother had taught her 60 years ago in Guadalajara, something passed down through generations of women who'd survived harder things than heartbreak. When we finished, she packed up a dozen tamales for me to take home. At her door, she hugged me tight and said, "You're going to be just fine, Clara. Better than fine." I believed her. That evening, I sat on my couch, the same couch where I'd read August's text about the missing wallet almost a year ago, and looked around my small apartment. The flickering light. The used furniture. The modest life I'd built with my own hands and my own work. Nothing had transformed into something magical or cinematic. I wasn't suddenly wealthy or successful or living in a different place. My circumstances were almost identical to what they'd been a year ago. But I was different in ways that mattered more than circumstances. I knew the difference between love and exploitation now. Between partnership and parasitism. Between staying because you hope things will change and leaving because you know they won't. The box I'd left at Sienna's door wasn't revenge. Not really. It was a declaration of my own worth, a line drawn in permanent marker that said, "I will not disappear for your convenience." Everything that came after, the location data, the other women, the court case, the slow rebuilding of my life, those were just the aftershocks of that first seismic choice to value myself over someone else's comfort. I didn't know what came next. Maybe I'd meet someone who saw me as a partner rather than a resource. Maybe I'd stay single and content with my pottery classes and my friendship with Mrs. Delgado and my Thursday evenings at the community center. Maybe something I couldn't even imagine yet. But whatever came, I'd face it as someone who'd learned the hardest way possible that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. August lost a woman who would have given him everything. Who'd worked herself to exhaustion trying to be enough for someone who'd never planned to meet her halfway. I found the version of myself I'd been burying under the weight of his needs. The version who took up space without apologizing. Who said no without explaining. Who knew her worth and refused to settle for less. My phone buzzed with a text from Janelle. "Hey, we're going out for drinks after shift tomorrow. You coming?" A year ago I would have said no automatically. Saved the money, stayed home, kept myself small and careful and constantly prepared for August's next emergency. I typed back, "Yeah. I'll be there." Outside my window the city continued on. Car horns and distant music and people living their lives. Ordinary sounds that felt like companionship now instead of loneliness. I made myself tea, picked up the book I'd been reading and curled up on my second-hand couch. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of me. My choices. My future. My life finally, mercifully, beautifully my own. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If this story of justice and reclaiming yourself had you hooked, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Clara delivered that box straight to Sienna's door at midnight, knowing exactly what she was doing. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.